That's one problem solved, he muttered, his voice carrying across the quiet evening air. I stood frozen behind the birch trees near my late husband's cabin, watching my son-in-law Evan hurl a heavy wooden box into Crescent Lake. The sound echoed across the still water. Thud, splash, silence. Ripples spread outward in perfect circles, swallowing whatever secret he'd just tried to drown. My breath caught in my throat as Evan straightened up, hands on his knees, staring at the spot where the box had disappeared. His silhouette was dark against the fading dusk light, his shoulders tense with the kind of guilt that comes from doing something you know is wrong. What problem had he just solved? And why did solving it require throwing something into the lake that had once reflected my grandchildren's laughter during summer visits? Evan glanced around nervously, his movements quick and jerky. I pressed myself harder against the rough bark of the birch tree, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he'd hear it. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, he turned and walked back toward the cabin, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I waited until I heard his car start and drive away before I dared to move. The next morning felt like moving underwater. Everything was distorted, nothing quite real. I sat at my own kitchen table, watching Evan butter his toast with casual ease, as if the previous night had never happened. Please tell me something in the comments section. Where are you watching this story from? And take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because every day there's a real story that will shake your heart. Didn't sleep well, Mom? He asked, his smile perfectly arranged on his face. Too perfect, like a mask he'd practiced wearing. My daughter Laura hummed softly beside him, pouring orange juice with careful concentration. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and that absence of connection told me everything I needed to know. She knew. Maybe she didn't know the specifics, but she knew something was wrong. I slept fine, I lied, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug for warmth I didn't really need. Evan took a bite of his toast and chewed thoughtfully, watching me over the rim of his coffee cup. We were thinking about doing some repairs on the lake cabin. The place is getting old. Maybe it's time to sell it. Property values have really gone up in that area. The smell of coffee turned my stomach. They were both pretending I hadn't been there last night, pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. And worse, they were already moving forward with plans involving property that wasn't theirs to sell. I forced myself to nod pleasantly. That's interesting. We should talk about that. But inside, my mind was cataloging every strange look, every forced smile, every word that felt just slightly off. 3 days of sleepless nights passed before I made my decision. I woke before dawn on the 4th day, dressed in warm clothes, and drove to the lake cabin alone. The morning mist curled across the water's surface like ghostly fingers reaching for secrets buried beneath. I found the small rowboat my husband James had kept for fishing trips and dragged it to the water's edge. My arms ached with the effort, reminding me sharply of my 74 years, but determination pushed me forward. I needed to know what Evan had thrown into that water. The lake was calm, almost eerily so. I rowed slowly toward the spot where I'd seen Evan standing that night, using the old dock and a distinctive birch tree as landmarks. The mist was thick enough to dampen my jacket and hair, making the world feel small and contained, like I was the only person who existed in this gray dawn. That's when I saw it. The wooden box had floated to the surface and drifted toward shore, caught in the reeds near the old fishing spot where James used to cast his line on Sunday mornings. The box was swollen with water, but still intact. My hands shook as I maneuvered the boat closer and reached for it. It was heavier than I expected, waterlogged and stubborn. I pulled with both hands, nearly tipping the rowboat before finally hauling it aboard. For a long moment, I just stared at it, suddenly afraid of what I'd find inside. Back at the dock, with the morning sun burning away the mist, I pried open the box with a screwdriver from the cabin's tool shed. The lid gave way with a groan of swollen wood protesting, and I peered inside with my heart in my throat. Papers. Dozens of them, damp but still readable. I spread them carefully across the weathered dock, and my heart nearly stopped when I recognized my late husband's handwriting on several documents. The deed to the lake cabin was there, yellowed with age but official and legal. It clearly named me, Marion Clark, as the sole owner following James's death 2 years ago. Yet Evan had been telling everyone that the property had been signed over to Laura months after the funeral, as part of settling the estate. I picked up another document with trembling hands. James's will. The original copy that had mysteriously vanished from the lawyer's office last year. Family letters in his careful script. Bank records showing account numbers I'd never seen before, never even knew existed. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the deed, someone had attempted to scratch out my name and write Laura's above it. The forgery was crude, obvious in the clear morning light. But in a quick glance, with official stamps and legal language surrounding it, someone might not look too closely. The betrayal felt physical, like hands squeezing my heart until I couldn't breathe. That afternoon, I called Laura and asked her to come over for tea. Just the two of us, mother and daughter. The way we used to spend Sunday afternoons before Evan had entered our lives and changed everything. We sat in my living room, the dried documents hidden upstairs in my bedroom. I held my teacup carefully, studying my daughter's face as I spoke. Laura, honey, I need to ask you something about the cabin. About the deed and the ownership papers. Do you remember what your father's will actually said? Laura's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. The china rattled against the saucer. Mom, we've been over this before. You're remembering it wrong. The cabin was meant for me and Evan. Dad wanted us to have it for our future. But the original deed. Evan's been handling all the legal paperwork for years now, she interrupted, still not meeting my eyes. You know how confusing those documents can be. All that legal language. From the doorway, Evan's voice made us both jump. I hadn't heard him arrive. Hadn't heard the front door open. She gets confused sometimes, he said, walking into the room with that easy smile plastered on his face. It's perfectly normal at her age. Nothing to worry about, really. The word confused landed like a physical slap. They were working together to make me doubt my own memory, my own mind, my own reality. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about erasing what I knew to be true and replacing it with their convenient fiction. 2 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. My name and address were typed on the front, the return address showing a real estate company I didn't recognize. My hands shook as I tore it open, already knowing deep in my gut that it wouldn't contain good news. It was a notice of sale. The Crescent Lake cabin was being officially listed on the market. My cabin. The place where James's ashes rested in an urn beneath the oak tree he'd planted on our 20th anniversary. The tree we'd watched grow together for decades. I read the notice 3 times, each word cutting deeper into my heart. The sale was scheduled to proceed in 30 days unless the property owner objected in writing to the real estate company. The contact name listed was Evan Pierce, my son-in-law, claiming authority as my legal power of attorney. I sat at my kitchen table for what felt like hours, the letter spread before me, my tea growing cold and forgotten in its cup. The afternoon light stretched long across the floor, and somewhere outside, children played in a neighbor's yard, their innocent laughter drifting through my windows. Finally, I folded the letter with careful, deliberate precision, creasing each edge perfectly. My hands were steady now, my mind suddenly crystal clear despite days of confusion and doubt. You made a mistake, I whispered to the empty room, thinking I wouldn't fight back. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months, but would never forget. Thomas Hale had been James's best friend since their college days at Boston University. They'd built their law practices together, raised their families in the same neighborhood, and spent countless weekends fishing together on Crescent Lake. When James died, Thomas had been there at the funeral, solid and grieving right alongside me. Now he sat across from me in his downtown office, the damp documents from the box spread across his mahogany desk. His reading glasses slipped down his nose as he examined each paper with the careful, methodical attention of someone who'd spent 40 years practicing law. These signatures, he said finally, pointing to the deed with his pen. One is definitely genuine. James is here at the bottom. I'd recognize his handwriting anywhere. But this one, He traced Laura's name that had been scratched above mine. Is a forgery. Not even a particularly good one, to be honest. Can you prove it? My voice came out smaller than I intended. Thomas looked at me over his glasses with the kind of serious expression that meant he was about to tell me something I needed to hear, but wouldn't like. In court? Absolutely. The handwriting analysis alone would be damning. But Marion, you need to understand something. This isn't just about the cabin. Evan's been trying to consolidate all your assets under his control. My stomach dropped. What do you mean, all my assets? I mean he's filed legal paperwork claiming power of attorney over your financial affairs. He's been telling banks and lawyers, and anyone who'll listen, that you're mentally incompetent to manage your own estate. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Can he actually do that? Not legally, not without a proper doctor's evaluation and your explicit consent. But he's trying. And if we don't stop him, he might succeed. That evening, I returned to my house with Thomas's warnings echoing in my mind like alarm bells. Instead of going to bed, exhausted as I was, I went to James's old study, the room I'd barely touched since his death 2 years ago. His desk sat in the corner by the window, covered with a thin layer of dust that made me feel guilty. I'd kept everything exactly as he'd left it, some irrational part of me not ready to pack away the final pieces of our life together. Now I was desperately grateful for my sentimental nature. I searched through the drawers methodically, pulling out folders of old utility bills and correspondence, tax returns and birthday cards. In the bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against something unusual. The wood felt different somehow, slightly raised in a way that didn't match the rest. A false bottom. My heart raced as I worked my fingernails under the edge and pried it up carefully. Inside the hidden compartment lay a leather folder I'd never seen before, hadn't known existed. I opened it with trembling hands that could barely grip the edges. Bank records. Insurance papers. Investment documents showing accounts in my name that I'd never known about, never been told existed. And there, placed carefully on top of everything else, a note written in James's distinctive handwriting. Marion, my love. If you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. Trust no one with the lake deed except yourself. The cabin is yours, always and only yours. Everything is documented here. I love you always. James. Tears blurred my vision as I read his words again and again, hearing his voice in my head. The next morning, I visited my neighbor Helen Burns under the friendly pretense of borrowing sugar. Helen was in her 60s and loved nothing more than a good conversation. And more importantly, she loved observing everything that happened on our quiet street. She noticed things other people missed. We sat in her sunny yellow kitchen, tea steeping between us and her good china, as I gently steered the conversation toward the lake cabin and recent activities there. Oh yes, Helen said, leaning forward with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing important information. I saw Evan out there just a few weeks ago, actually. It must have been early March. He was burning something in that old metal bin near the dock, you know, the one. There was quite a lot of smoke. My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice casual. Did he happen to mention what he was burning? He said he was cleaning up old files for you, getting rid of clutter and outdated paperwork. I thought it was really nice of him to help you organize James's things after all this time. She paused, reading something in my expression. Was it not nice? I forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster on my face. Just curious about which files he was handling. Did you see what exactly he burned? Papers, lots of them. A whole box full, it looked like. It took him nearly an hour to burn everything. He kept feeding pages into the fire, one after another. So the box I'd found in the lake wasn't the first one. Evan had already destroyed other documents, probably anything else that clearly proved my ownership and his fraud. He'd only resorted to throwing this box in the water when burning became too noticeable, too likely to raise suspicion from observant neighbors like Helen. Thank you, Helen, I said, standing to leave. You've been incredibly helpful. More helpful than she could possibly know. Laura called the next evening, her voice artificially bright on the phone. Mom, we're having a small dinner party tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just a few friends. Would you like to come? I knew a performance when I was being invited to one, but I accepted anyway. Sometimes you had to walk directly into the trap to understand how it worked, to see all its moving parts. Their dining room was crowded with people I vaguely recognized from Laura's social circle, colleagues from her work, neighbors from their subdivision, friends I'd met briefly at previous gatherings. Evan held court at the head of the table, drinking wine and talking loudly about business opportunities and property investments. The lake house has incredible potential, he told a man I didn't know, gesturing with his wine glass. Once we modernize it properly, tear down that old structure, and rebuild something contemporary, the value will easily triple. We're thinking of breaking ground on renovations next month. I set down my fork very carefully, the silver clinking against the china plate. The table's conversation continued flowing around me like water around a stone, but I waited patiently for a natural pause. Evan, I said quietly but very clearly, selling property without all legal owners' consent is actually illegal. I thought you knew that, being so business savvy. The table went absolutely silent. Every face turned toward me, then swiveled toward Evan like spectators at a tennis match. His jaw tightened visibly, muscles working beneath his skin. Laura's face went pale as milk. Mom, Laura said quickly, forcing out a laugh that sounded brittle and fake. You're confused again. We talked about this, remember? Dad's will was very clear. I remember perfectly, I said, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze. I remember everything, actually. Every single detail. The phone call came the very next afternoon while I was in my garden, pulling weeds with more force than strictly necessary, channeling my anger into something productive. Mrs. Clark? This is Brandon Wells from First National Bank. I'm calling about the loan paperwork. I straightened up slowly, dirt still under my fingernails. What loan are you referring to? A long pause on the other end. The home equity loan using the Crescent Lake property as collateral, ma'am. We just need your signature on the final documents to complete the process. Didn't your son-in-law explain this to you? My vision went dark at the edges. No. He did not explain anything. 90 minutes later, I sat in the bank manager's corner office, looking at documents that made my hands shake with rage. Evan had applied for a $200,000 loan, using my cabin, my property, as collateral. The loan application stated the money was for his failing consulting business, for operational expenses and debt consolidation. He told us he had legal power of attorney over your affairs, the manager explained, looking increasingly uncomfortable as he watched my expression. We have a copy of the document on file. It appeared legitimate. That document is completely fraudulent, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the fury building in my chest like a storm. I never, ever gave him power of attorney over anything. The manager's face shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely alarmed. Mrs. Clark, if what you're saying is true, we need to halt this entire process immediately and contact our legal department. If I hadn't found that box in the lake, if I hadn't discovered the truth just in time, I would have lost everything. My home would have been seized to pay for Evan's business debts, and I would have been completely powerless to stop any of it. Thomas Hale became my shadow over the following weeks, my partner in this careful investigation. We met in quiet coffee shops and in his law office, always discreet, always methodical, building our case piece by patient piece. Document absolutely everything, he instructed, handing me a small digital recorder that fit in the palm of my hand. Every conversation with them, every claim they make, every single interaction. But you need to be subtle about it. Don't let them know you're recording. I bought a large wicker knitting basket and kept the recorder hidden beneath colorful balls of yarn. It became my constant companion, sitting innocently beside my chair while I appeared to do nothing more threatening than work on scarves and blankets. At family dinners, I asked gentle, seemingly innocent questions. Evan, could you explain to me again exactly how you came to manage my financial accounts? At the grocery store, when I happened to run into Laura, I'd mentioned something casual about the cabin, carefully recording her dismissive or evasive responses. Thomas reviewed each recording in his office, taking notes in his precise lawyer's handwriting, building timelines and documenting patterns. "This is excellent work, Marion. We're building a comprehensive case that shows clear patterns of deception and manipulation. Will it be enough to stop him?" He looked at me with the serious expression I'd come to recognize. "It will be if we're patient and absolutely thorough. Justice isn't fast, but it's extremely reliable when you have solid evidence." So I waited, and I watched, and I recorded everything. Each small lie, each dismissive comment, each attempt to paint me as confused or incompetent. All of it is carefully saved, meticulously dated, and properly documented. The home health nurse appeared at my front door exactly 2 weeks later, clipboard in my hand and a professional smile on her face. Evan had arranged it, she explained, expressing concerns about my declining health and need for regular monitoring. Her name was Patricia Freeman, a kind-looking woman in her 50s with warm brown eyes and the capable hands of someone who'd spent decades caring for others. She came 3 times each week, ostensibly to check my blood pressure, ensure I was taking medications properly, and help with light household tasks. But I noticed how she took extensive notes after each visit, writing detailed observations in a leather-bound journal she carried everywhere. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, I decided to ask her directly about it. Patricia hesitated at my front door, clearly wrestling with professional ethics and personal conscience. Finally, she spoke quietly. "Mrs. Clark, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but your son-in-law specifically asked me to document any signs of confusion, memory problems, or cognitive decline. For legal purposes," he said. "To help protect you." My hands trembled slightly, though not with fear. With pure cold fury. Did he specify what kind of legal purposes? He mentioned something about competency evaluations and ensuring you receive proper care. Patricia met my eyes directly. "But I want you to know," I told him, "I haven't observed any such issues whatsoever. You're mentally sharper than most people half your age, Mrs. Clark." He seemed quite disappointed by my assessment. I looked at this woman who'd been hired specifically to provide ammunition against me, to build a case for my incompetence. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Patricia. I'm a nurse, not a spy," she said firmly, squaring her shoulders. "My loyalty is to my patients and their well-being, not to whoever happens to be paying my invoice." After she left, I carefully added her testimony to my growing file of evidence, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. I began deliberately playing the role Evan expected of me. I moved slower around the house, spoke more hesitantly in conversations, let sentences trail off mid-thought as if I'd forgotten what I was trying to say. It felt like betraying my own mind, but Thomas had specifically advised this approach. "Let him think he's winning," Thomas had counseled. "Overconfident people make careless mistakes. They stop being careful." So I played confused when Evan visited, nodding vaguely when he discussed elaborate plans for my care and future living arrangements. I pretended not to notice when Laura slipped documents in front of me to sign, though I read every single word carefully before politely declining. Gradually, I watched Evan relax. I could see it clearly in his posture, in the way he stopped carefully choosing his words around me, stopped watching me quite so intently. One evening, standing in my kitchen while I pretended to search for tea bags I was actually holding in my hand, he spoke to Laura as if I wasn't even present in the room. "We'll be able to handle everything soon," he said confidently. "Another month, maybe 2 at most, and we can move forward with the formal competency hearing. Then all this hassle will be finished." I kept my face deliberately blank and confused looking, but my knitting basket sat on the counter nearby, recorder running silently beneath the cheerful yarn. Every single word was being saved, documented, preserved as evidence. Meanwhile, Thomas worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering official documentation, and building our legal case. He met with the county recorder's office, meticulously compared signature samples, and pulled complete filing histories going back years. The evidence he uncovered was absolutely damning. Evan had filed altered documents at the county office exactly 3 months ago, presenting a property deed with clearly forged signatures. He'd used what appeared to be an old photocopy of my signature, probably lifted from a birthday card or similar document, and literally pasted it onto new paperwork. It's textbook fraud, Thomas explained, showing me the side-by-side comparison under his office's bright lights. Completely obvious once you know to look for it. The county recorder confirmed they never properly verified the signature, because Evan presented himself as acting legitimately on your behalf with power of attorney. Which he absolutely never had, I said. Which he absolutely never had. Thomas agreed with grim satisfaction. And now the county office is mortified they didn't catch this initially. They'll provide testimony in court if we need it, and they're cooperating fully with the investigation. The trap was slowly but surely tightening around Evan, and he remained completely oblivious. He thought he was the clever predator, but he'd actually wandered into an elaborate snare of his own making, constructed from his own lies and fraudulent actions. Thomas filed formal fraud complaints with both the county and the bank. Official investigations began. And through it all, I continued playing confused and harmless, quietly knitting in my chair while the slow but relentless machinery of justice ground steadily forward. Evan suddenly insisted on throwing me an elaborate birthday party. To show the whole community that you're still an important part of this family, he said, his smile not quite reaching his cold eyes. My 75th birthday arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear blue skies. Their house was filled with neighbors and Laura's various friends, people who'd known me for years, who'd watched me raise Laura, who remembered James. I wore my best navy dress and smiled graciously as people wished me well, and handed me wrapped gifts. Halfway through the dinner, as Evan stood up to make a toast about families taking care of their own in difficult times, I rose slowly from my seat. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning curiously toward me. I'd like to make a toast as well, I said, my voice steady and surprisingly strong. I raised my glass and looked directly at Evan across the crowded room. To be honest, the one thing this house has been missing for far too long. The silence that followed was absolutely profound. Guests shifted very uncomfortably in their chairs. Laura's face went completely white. Evan's carefully practiced smile froze unnaturally on his face, his wine glass suspended awkwardly in midair. To truth finally coming to light, I continued clearly, no matter how long it's been deliberately hidden underwater. I drank from my glass, and slowly, very uncertainly, other guests raised their glasses. But the party never recovered its previously festive atmosphere. People began leaving early, making polite excuses, and I heard anxious whispers in the hallway as they gathered their coats and purses. The performance was over, and everyone sensed something was terribly wrong. Late that same night, long after the last guests had departed, Evan found me alone in the kitchen washing wine glasses. Laura had retreated upstairs with a migraine, and the house had finally fallen quiet. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and his friendly mask had completely vanished. This was the real Evan, the one my daughter had somehow married without truly seeing. You think you're clever, don't you, Marion? I kept washing glasses, not looking at him directly. I think I know exactly what you threw in that lake. His jaw visibly clenched. You need to be very careful. You'll end up in a nursing home before this year is out. A nice, quiet place where confused old women can be properly supervised and kept safe from themselves. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel, and turned to face him directly. His eyes were cold, calculating, completely devoid of warmth. This was the man who'd planned to steal everything from me. Maybe I will end up there, I said quietly. But at least I'll sleep every night with a completely clear conscience. Will you be able to say the same thing, Evan? He pushed off from the doorframe and took a deliberate step closer, looming over me in what I recognized as an intimidation tactic. For just a moment, I thought he might actually become physically threatening. But then he smiled instead, and it was sharp and cruel. You have absolutely no idea what's coming for you. Neither do you, I replied calmly. His smile faltered slightly before he turned and walked away. Thomas filed our formal legal inquiry on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, investigators from the County Fraud Division were sitting in Evan's office, asking very pointed questions. I wasn't physically there to witness it, but Laura called me shortly after, her voice high and panicked. Mom, they're freezing all of Evan's bank accounts. They're asking detailed questions about the cabin, about property papers, about signatures on documents. What's happening? Why didn't you tell me? The truth is happening, I said gently but firmly. Finally, after being buried for so long. The investigation moved with surprising speed once it officially began. The bank cooperated fully and eagerly, desperate to distance themselves from the fraudulent loan application. The county recorder's office provided detailed testimony about the altered deed. Patricia Freeman submitted her professional notes clearly showing I was mentally sound and completely capable. And I handed over every single recording I'd carefully made, every document from James's hidden drawer, every piece of evidence Thomas and I had painstakingly compiled over weeks. Evan blustered and threatened, and made wild accusations. He hired an expensive lawyer who tried desperately to paint me as a vindictive old woman, confused and easily manipulated by others with their own agendas. But the evidence was simply overwhelming and undeniable. For the first time since I'd watched him throw that box into the lake, Evan looked genuinely scared. He sat in the county courthouse in his expensive suit that suddenly seemed too large for him, and watched helplessly as his carefully constructed lies systematically crumbled. I sat quietly in the gallery with my hands folded and watched justice slowly unfold. Laura started visiting me alone after the preliminary hearing. She'd arrive in the evenings, her face drawn and pale, sitting at my kitchen table exactly like she used to as a troubled teenager seeking advice. I didn't know, she said one night, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the table. I swear to you, Mom, I genuinely thought the cabin really was supposed to be ours. Evan showed me official-looking papers, and I just believed him without question. I listened without judgment or interruption, letting her speak and purge her guilt. He told me you were starting to forget things, that you were getting confused and needed protection from yourself. He made it sound like we were helping you, keeping you safe. Her voice broke completely. I was trying to be a good daughter. I didn't think he'd go this far. I didn't know about the forgery, the loan, any of it. I reached across the worn table and took her trembling hand in mine. It's not too late to remember who you really are, Laura. To remember what your father spent your whole childhood teaching you about integrity and honesty. She squeezed my hand tightly, sobbing openly now like a child. I'm so incredibly sorry, Mom. I know you are, sweetheart. I know. But knowing someone was sorry and actually forgiving them were two completely different things. And I wasn't quite ready for forgiveness yet. Maybe eventually. Maybe someday. But definitely not today. The official county hearing lasted exactly 3 hours. I sat straight-backed in my chair at the plaintiff's table, answering every question clearly and precisely, my mind sharp and my memory perfect. Thomas presented our extensive evidence methodically and professionally. The recordings that proved Evan's deception, the documents from James's hidden drawer, the expert testimony about obviously forged signatures, Patricia Freeman's professional assessment of my complete mental competence. Evan's expensive lawyer tried valiantly to create reasonable doubt, suggesting I was confused or that this was all simply a tragic misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion by family drama. But when the judge asked me to speak directly about the events, I responded calmly and firmly. Your Honor, my son-in-law deliberately attempted to steal my property through systematic fraud and forgery. He manipulated my daughter, forged legal documents, and actively tried to have me declared mentally incompetent to cover up his crimes. The evidence speaks clearly for itself. The judge reviewed all the materials spread before him on the bench, his expression growing progressively grimmer with each document he examined. Finally, he looked up and stared at Evan with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Pierce, I find absolutely overwhelming evidence of fraud, deliberate forgery, and elder abuse. I'm restoring full and complete ownership of the Crescent Lake property to Mrs. Marion Clark, effective immediately. Additionally, I'm referring this entire case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Evan's face went completely ashen. Outside the courthouse afterward, Thomas squeezed my shoulder supportively. You did it, Marion. You actually did it. I looked back at the imposing building. No, Thomas. The truth did it. I just refused to let it stay buried at the bottom of that lake. The following week, moving trucks appeared at Evan and Laura's house. I deliberately didn't go to watch, but neighbors who did told me about it later over coffee and sympathy. Evan had stormed around shouting at the movers, they said, while Laura sat quietly and numbly on the front steps like she was in shock. He'd lost his consulting business when the bank fraud investigation expanded beyond just my case. Lost his professional reputation when word spread quickly through their entire social and business circles. Lost absolutely everything he'd tried so desperately to steal from me. One quiet afternoon, Laura appeared at my door with a single suitcase and red, swollen eyes. Her hands trembled visibly as she stood on my porch. Can I please come in? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside wordlessly, and she entered the house where she'd grown up, where she'd been a happy child. We sat together in the kitchen where I'd taught her to bake cookies, and I made tea with steady hands while she stared at her own hands like they belonged to a stranger. I'm leaving him, she said finally, the words coming out flat and emotionless. I filed for divorce yesterday morning. I set a steaming cup before her carefully. That must have taken real courage. You wanted a new beginning, I said softly, pulling out one of her old sweaters I'd kept stored in the hall closet. Now you have the opportunity for exactly that. What you choose to do with it is entirely up to you. She looked up at me with tears spilling over again. Can you ever forgive me, Mom? Eventually, I said honestly, meeting her eyes. But first, you have to learn to forgive yourself. That's actually the harder part. The town's reaction genuinely surprised me. People who'd been whispering about my supposedly failing memory at church now stopped me specifically to apologize. Helen Burns hugged me tightly in the grocery store produce section. Even Patricia Freeman, who'd quit working for Evan, became a regular visitor for afternoon tea. You showed everyone what real strength looks like, Helen told me earnestly one Sunday after church services. Standing up for yourself when literally everyone thought you were too old, too confused, too weak to fight back. I smiled faintly at the compliment. Sometimes it just takes time for the truth to swim back up to the surface where people can see it clearly. The story spread far beyond our small town's boundaries. A regional newspaper ran a detailed article about elder fraud and financial abuse, using my case as a primary example. Other families started coming forward with disturbingly similar stories of manipulation and theft by trusted relatives. Thomas told me later that I'd inadvertently started something much bigger than just my own personal justice. You gave other people the courage they needed to fight back against their own abusers. I hadn't set out to become any kind of symbol or advocate. I'd simply wanted to keep what was rightfully mine and honor James's memory properly. But if my stubborn refusal to be victimized helped others find their own strength, I suppose that made it all worthwhile. 3 months after the hearing concluded, Evan appeared at my front door on a cold, rainy November evening. He looked absolutely terrible, gaunt, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled jacket that had clearly seen much better days. "Marion," he said, his voice rough and broken. "Please, you have to listen. You completely ruined me." I stood in the doorway without inviting him inside. Rain dripped steadily from his unwashed hair, forming small puddles at his feet on my porch. I lost absolutely everything. My business, my reputation, my marriage, my career. I can't get work anywhere in this state. I've been completely blacklisted in my industry. I looked at this man who'd tried to steal my entire life away, who'd manipulated my daughter and forged my dead husband's documents without a shred of remorse. I felt no satisfaction in witnessing his suffering, but I felt absolutely no guilt either. "No, Evan," I said quietly but firmly. "You did that entirely to yourself. Every single choice, every calculated lie, every document you deliberately forged, those were all your own decisions. I simply refused to let you profit from committing crimes against me. I have nothing left," he said desperately, his voice cracking. "I'm literally sleeping in my car most nights." "Then now you know exactly how it feels to have everything taken from you," I replied. "That's precisely what you tried to do to me. You tried to steal my home, my independence, my dignity, my late husband's legacy." He stared at me through the rain running down his face. It might have been tears mixed in, might have been just water. I couldn't tell, and frankly didn't care anymore. "Don't ever come back here again," I said, and closed the door firmly. Laura stayed with me for the next 6 months while her divorce proceedings slowly worked through the legal system. We learned to live together again, mother and daughter, carefully navigating the damaged trust that lay broken between us like shattered glass. She found a job at the town library, started attending weekly therapy sessions, and began the long process of rebuilding her life on honest foundations instead of Evan's lies. Some evenings, we'd sit together on the porch and talk about everything: her father, her failed marriage, her profound regrets and hard-learned lessons. "I still don't understand how I completely missed what Evan was doing," she said one warm night, fireflies dancing in the darkening yard beyond us. "Love makes us willfully blind sometimes," I replied, watching the lights blink on and off. "You desperately wanted to believe in him, in your marriage, in the future you'd planned together. That's not a weakness, Laura. That's just being human. But you saw through him eventually." I shook my head slowly. "Not at first, honey. Not immediately. I saw him throw that box in the lake, and even then, part of me wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation. We only see what we're emotionally ready to see." She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to as a small child. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything I put you through." "I know you are, sweetheart. And I'm slowly learning to let it go, to forgive." It wasn't complete forgiveness yet, not entirely. Trust took considerable time to rebuild properly, like a badly broken bone that had to heal slowly and carefully. But we were genuinely trying, working at it every day. That had to count for something meaningful. Exactly 1 year after that fateful night by the lake, I stood on the old dock at dawn with a single white lily held carefully in my hands. Morning mist curled softly across the water's calm surface, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and dreamlike. The cabin behind me had been lovingly repaired and updated, not for selling, but for living and remembering. For my grandchildren to visit during summers. For Laura and I to spend peaceful weekends. For keeping James's memory vibrantly alive in the place he'd loved most in this world. I looked down at the dark water where Evan had thrown that box, genuinely believing he was drowning incriminating evidence forever. But water doesn't keep secrets buried. It eventually returns what doesn't belong in its depths, pushes truth back up to the surface where it can finally be seen clearly. I tossed the lily gently onto the water and watched it float, stark white against the dark surface. For the lies that sank, I whispered to the morning air, and the truth that rose back up. The flower drifted slowly toward shore, caught by invisible currents beneath the surface. Behind me, I heard Laura's familiar footsteps on the wooden dock. She came and stood quietly beside me, and together we watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. My name is Marion Clark. I'm 75 years old now, and I know exactly what family truly means. Not blind loyalty or convenient lies, but love that's strong enough to demand truth and forgiveness that must be earned through genuine change and time. The lake was perfectly calm now, clean, ready for new memories to be made. And so was I.